Hi there again. Let's resume with segment 2 of our Unit 2 online lecture on farm grain drying and storage. We're going to get into some more high temperature grain drying systems here in this segment. Also going to finish up with a video, gentleman from Minnesota that does a great job of explaining his grain drying system and how everything works, and actually takes you inside a little bit of it. So let's first start with high temperature bin drying. So kind of like a batch in bin process is what we're thinking about. So you create a bin that, or you have a bin that essentially serves as a batch dryer, where you put in a 3 to 4 foot deep layer of grain, start the fan and the heater, and typical drying temperatures are going to be up around that 120 to 160 range. You'll see that's quite a bit lower than we get to the column dryers here in a little bit. And so airflow rates are going to be somewhere in that 8 to 15 cubic feet per minute per bushel of grain. And so generally speaking, you'd like to have about less than 1 percentage point difference moisture between the top layer and the bottom layer. That's very difficult to do if you're going to do batch and bin drying. Plus, you already can tell one of the challenges here is a 3 to 4 foot layer at a time, and then you got to maybe do something else if you have grain that doesn't match that. You have to have plenty of bin space to do that, but also requires a stirrator in your bin to keep that grain moving and shifting, and hopefully then you don't have the problem with hot spots. You keep it stirring up, and so that it'll dry more evenly. One of the challenges that you have to deal with here always when you talk about a drying bin with a stirrator is the stirrator doesn't stir the core, the center, exactly the center of the bin. Some diameter there that there's no airflow to, and so it's important whenever you bin dry grain, you probably need to come back and do what we call core the bin, which means pull a couple loads out the center of the bin in order to clean out that core, run it back into a bin so that grain can stay in good condition. Otherwise, you can plug up your sump hole that goes to your unloading auger, and it gets to be a major pain in order to get grain out of the bin. That's a huge challenge occasionally whenever you run into years where you've got grain going in the bin that's not exactly at the right moisture. A recirculating bin dryer system has a recirculating bin, kind of with a tapered sweep, removing grain from the bottom as it dries, and then transferring it to a drying bin. And I have a diagram here on this page, moves it to the top of the bin, so you can kind of see a constant vertical recirculation of the bin dryer. These systems are not readily used anymore because they just very difficult for some of them to keep up with today's harvest conditions, and they're fairly slow. So there may be some still sitting out there, and if any of you run them, they were good in their time, but probably have been passed up in efficiency and cost efficiency by some of the other systems. You will find a continuous flow bin dryer on occasion, and here we're talking about a kind of a two bin setup, which again incorporates that tapered sweep auger, removing grain and circulating grain in a drying bin, and then removing it as it gets dry, transferring it to a cooling bin. So you have kind of a two bin setup that works fairly well as it recirculates kind of continuously in the drying bin until it gets to the moisture that's appropriate, and then is transferred to the cooling bin. And here's a diagram that kind of demonstrates that. And what you don't see over here in the center of this bin is that column auger going up, and many of these have them in there still. And then that sweep auger that's going to rotate around, and we're going to circulate that bin in this, circulate that grain in this bin. And then as it hits the correct moisture, it'll be drawn out, transferred as hot grain into the cooling bin over here, or to a grain leg to be transferred to any number of bins. But that one you'll still see in operation on occasion. Column batch dryers are really the more common on-farm batch drying system. Basically, a dryer system that can be completely filled at any one time, and it actually works best when it is completely full. And so there's two columns surrounded by surrounding a plenum chamber in the center, which is the airflow structure. And you'll see in the video that the gentleman that I have that's created here, you'll see airflow pockets and perforated tin in which air that gets forced out through the corn so it can dry, and then forced outside to the dryer. So, and batch capacity can be rather small all the way up to very, very quickly. And oftentimes those grain columns will be on the outside, and dependent upon the design, either they'll flow all the way down or they may crisscross in the center in order to mix and exchange before it goes to the bottom drying chamber. So wet grain is constantly fed in at the top, and dry grain and cool grain is constantly drawn off the bottom. So, and dependent upon how you choose to set it, may dictate what the temperatures are top and bottom. So, and then as it's drawn off, it's sent to its storage bin location. Advantages here: the dryer then does not really occupy grain storage. You do need a bin that kind of feeds it, so a wet bin that does feed it, but it's not necessarily a situation where you're going to have a large bin that you would prefer to have in storage. The disadvantage is the heat available to dry is not always efficient as deep bed drying. It's expensive to run these things. These are probably the most expensive of the options that we will discuss in this unit. So this is, if I move myself here out of the way, a column batch dryer, a little bit on how it's designed. So a little bit of wet holding capacity at the top, and then grain flowing down the bottom or down the sides, that then we're forcing air through that grain and out the side of the chamber, and then sensors here at the bottom that will test for grain moisture content. And as it reaches the target moisture content, it will then begin to draw off that dried grain. You'll also see them that will crisscross here in the center as you get to the bottom chamber. That's usually a lower temperature. You'll see that grain crisscross, so it has the opportunity to mix there. You'll see two different designs. So I'm going to start this gentleman's YouTube here. It runs about 13 minutes long. Does a great job of explaining their drying system. Hope you enjoy.
It's a bit too wet to be out harvesting today, so I figure I'll take this time to show you guys how our pits and our grain dryer and our grain bins work. It's pretty quiet this morning. We got the grain dryer shut off because we didn't want it running at night while it was raining. So it's a good time to do this. I'm going to start at the very beginning and tell you guys that this truck is full of corn. I'm going to dump it into the pits and show you what happens to it from there. Each of these pits are 500 bushels apiece. That way we can dump 1,000 bushels at a time. They'll each fit 500 out of the truck. A truckload is about 500 bushels. You can see the grain goes in the bottom there, ends up in the bottoms of the augers, and it gets fed up here into the grain lake. While the truck is dumping, we can go ahead and turn on our pit augers. Start the leg up here. Next thing we do is start these augers up. These pit augers will run automatically until these pits are completely empty of corn. Once these pits are empty, the augers sense that there's no load on them and they'll automatically shut down. Once the grain goes up the grain lake, it'll go one to two places. The first place it'll go is down this pipe and into the back of the grain dryer. If the grain dryer is full and this pipe is full, it will overflow into this pipe and come down here into what we call the holding tank or the wet bin. The majority of the corn is going to end up going into the wet bin over here before it gets transferred back into the leg, up to the top, and down into the dryer. So the truck is empty. The pits still have plenty of corn in them, but at this point, if we were out harvesting, this truck could take off, head out to the field, and meet the combine or the grain cart back out there, because these pits and these augers will automatically handle themselves. Eventually, all of the grain in this wet bin needs to come out here and end up going through the grain dryer. because we want to store and sell this corn at about 15% moisture. Right now we're taking it out of the field around 25, 26%, which is way too high to store it safely for any period of time. That's the reason we need to run it through the grain dryer. Now the grain dryer automatically feeds the corn from the top to the bottom and sends it out through the back. I'll show you guys that in a minute. But before I get to that, I need to tell you that there's two sensors at the top of the grain dryer that let the system know when the grain dryer needs more corn. Once those sensors flip over and tell the system that the grain dryer needs more corn, this motor and that motor will automatically kick in to take grain out of the wet tank, back into the leg, where the priority feed is into the downspout at the top of the leg, and over into the grain dryer. Once the corn comes up through the leg and into this downspout, and down into the top of the grain dryer here, there's an auger system inside the grain dryer that runs through here that evenly distributes the corn throughout all the columns inside the dryer. Now the corn doesn't actually sit down in the middle of this grain dryer the way a lot of people would think. It actually fills up only inside the walls. The center of this dryer is hollow. You can see here, the walls of this dryer are perforated. They're perforated on the inside and the outside to allow the air, the hot air, to come from the inside and push to the outside through the corn. This specific dryer is what they call a double stack. So it has a top and a bottom system to this dryer. This dryer is actually full right now, so it's full of corn. I'm going to open the back door and show you guys what's inside. This is actually the center of the dryer. The heat comes from the fans and the burners up there and gets pushed through the center here. The corn is packed inside these walls. Again, these are perforated, so the air is forced to push out through these perforations, come out through the corn, and the steam coming out the side of the dryer that you guys see in my videos is the actual moisture coming out of the kernels. As the corn comes in the top and fills the walls on each side of the dryer, when it gets to the point where it crosses between the top and the bottom, it crisscrosses in here. It mixes, comes down to the bottom. There you can see where I've still got the inside open, and eventually it slowly makes its way all the way down here to the discharge chute.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Brands and Empires. You may be here because you saw a link on social media or you got a notification.
Once the grain reaches the bottom of the dryer and it slowly gets rolled and augered out to the discharge chute here, it drops down into what we call the air system. This great big motor and this fan here actually use air pressure blowing through this pipe to grab the grain and push it through this air system. Back here is what we call the exchanger. This is where we can switch and go into any different bin on this site by moving where the air pipe is located. Right now, we're jumping into this pipe here. This pipe wraps up, goes to the very top of this bin right here. So this is where all the grain is going into that leaves the back of that dryer the way we currently have it set. The noise you hear back here are the fans. We run those fans on the bins because they push air through the floor, underneath the floor, and it's perforated just like the walls of the dryer, and it pushes air up through the grain to help store better. It also helps the grain dry out a little bit more and cool down after it's left the dryer. Fans are really important for the storage of the grain. If we don't run those, that grain can spoil. What we typically try and do here is run them up until the point where everything freezes hard. Then we run it a few more days just to freeze that corn really, really good. And then our grain actually stays frozen solid for several months throughout the winter. This thing's ready to fire up. What do you say we do it? Now right here, this is the controls for the air system. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on right away. That way this system will automatically kick on once I start emptying this dryer. Inside here, this is our screen that is the main control for the grain dryer. Everything with the grain dryer is controlled from this touch screen. Before I start it up, I should mention that at the front of the dryer, inside here, there are great big centrifugal fans that blow and force the air out and through the corn. There's also a set of burners on the top and the bottom that heat that air up. Right now we've got it set for 200 degrees on the bottom and 220 degrees at top. That's the temperature inside that center column where the dryer is hollow. That's the temperature of the air that it's pushing out through the corn. So I've already got my screen set to manual operation. That's where we typically run it. It does have an automatic setting so that you don't have to change much. I can see my moisture sensor is reading really, really high. That's because of the rain. I'm going to walk back there, drop that moisture sensor, and clean it off, because otherwise it takes a couple hours to start reading accurately. has automatically turned on, and it's going to run enough corn up there and down into the dryer to make sure that that dryer is 100% full. The next thing I'm going to do is turn on my fans. You're going to hear some squealing noises from that. That's the huge fans kicking in with wet belts. So the fans are up and running. They're pushing air through the grain right now. Meanwhile, this auger back here just finished loading, so the dryer is completely full. The next thing I'm going to do is turn my heat on. That will kick on the burners and start sending heat through those fans and out through the corn. Right here is my plenum temperatures. I've got those set right now at 200 and 220. So you will see these temperatures start climbing once those burners kick in. These will start climbing really quickly. There we got just a little bit of steam starting to come out the top there. So we know we're starting to build up a little bit of temperature. This is actually as loud as the grain dryer itself gets. The sound that you guys hear, that loud humming, whiny sound that you guys hear in my videos all the time, is actually this air system and the blower motor pushing the air through the pipes to send the corn to the grain bin. So now that I'm comfortable, I know everything is set where I want it. You can see these plenum temperatures climbing really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and turn my unload on. There you can hear the air system kicked on. So that's this motor back here running the air through the pipes. Now I've got my meter roll here set at 0%. That means the bottom of the dryer is not running at all to dump corn into those air pipes. What I usually do is start it slow at about 5%, listen for the corn and go check to make sure that the corn's going where we want it to be going. I don't see any leaks going on back there. That's good. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that meter roll speed up so that that dryer will feed out faster. I know that the corn inside the dryer is actually pretty dry because it spent a little bit extra time in there last time while we were waiting for these plenum temps to cool down. So I'm turning it to 17%. That's fairly quick for the grain that we have in there, but I'm going to wait and watch this and let this come down. I'm also going to test some corn right out of the back of the dryer in a minute. I'm going to take this corn and check it manually. It does have moisture sensor on the back of the dryer to tell us what it's coming out at, but that moisture sensor is a computer, and oftentimes computers are wrong, just like right now. All right, that corn is coming out right now at around 14% or just over. Plenty dry, so I'm going to leave it on 17% meter roll speed. I'm going to come back in about 20 minutes, half an hour, and check it again. These old Dole moisture testers, they keep going. They're accurate. Now this system will run automatically as long as everything works the way it's supposed to and nothing slips a belt or plugs an auger or blows an air pipe off. The trucks can keep coming in and out and just automatically dump into those pits, turn the augers on, and that corn will go to where it needs to, either first to the dryer or over to the wet tank. Every time the dryer calls for it, this auger back here will kick on and automatically load grain into the dryer. After that, grain goes in the dryer, slowly makes its way to the bottom into the air system where it's sent out into the grain bin we want it sent to. Now we monitor this thing as often as we possibly can. Throughout the night, Dad and I take turns switching back and forth, usually checking on it every 2 to 3 hours throughout the night. The big things we want to look for, number one, is to make sure one of those air pipes haven't popped off and put 1,000 bushels of corn or more on the ground. So that's number one. Second thing we look at is the moisture. We'll look at this computer. We'll also take a manual sample just to make sure that everything's coming out right, because we don't want to have a grain bin full of something that's too wet. Otherwise, that grain is going to rot on us. So if we put it in there too wet, we've got to get it out right away and resend it back through the system. We definitely don't want to have to do that. It's time-consuming and expensive. Other things that can go wrong when it's raining, these belts. We've got a ton of belts on everything out here. All these augers are run by belts. Somebody asked about making them chain drive. What would happen if you made them chain drive is when you have a problem, you'd end up wrecking something in the motor instead of the belt. And so the belts are kind of the safest way. Everything is just belt driven. That's really just the way it is, and I think that's the safest way to do it. But once in a while, you'll get a belt wet, and you'll slip that belt. It'll smoke the belt or burn it. Sometimes it'll burn right through it. The belt will come off. You end up with a plugged auger. It's no fun. It's a battle, but it's one of the things we got to watch for to make sure everything is running right. If you guys have more questions, go ahead and throw them down in the comments. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can.
Hey, I hope you found that interesting to listen to. He does a great job of explaining their grain handling system. So we're going to wrap up segment 2 here and finish up with some of the keys to the outcomes of good grain drying. Thanks for tuning into this segment 2 video.